Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so today we are going to completely deconstruct the intensely polarized modern debate between atheism and theism. I mean, if you spend any time online at all, you've definitely seen this war play out, right? It's usually pitched as this epic battle of pure rational inquiry fighting against blind, dogmatic superstition. But when we actually pull back the lens, we find a truly surprising psychological reflection. We're going to explore how the most rigid materialists out there often completely mirror the exact behaviors of the religious fundamentalists they claim to oppose. It's fascinating stuff.
Let's kick things off by challenging a massive cultural assumption. Who is the real fundamentalist? We typically think of fundamentalism as this exclusively religious phenomenon, someone aggressively thumping a holy book. But our sources suggest something completely different. Fundamentalism is actually a cognitive habit. It's a psychological mechanism that can infect absolutely any worldview. Really, it's an epistemic attitude characterized by unfalsifiable premises, a super-aggressive identity defense, and a total closure to outside inquiry. Because, think about it, when a worldview becomes your entire identity, any questioning of it feels like a personal attack. And honestly, that perfectly explains why the resulting behavior is often so incredibly condescending.
Let's actually put them side by side. Consider the religious literalist. They impose this rigid top-down dogma and condescend to anyone who doesn't believe in their specific celestial autocrat. Now contrast them with the rigid materialist. They aggressively police the boundaries of valid inquiry, just instantly dismissing anything that isn't purely physical as mere delusion. When you look at it this way, we uncover a stunning epistemic mirror. Both sides suffer from an identical loss of epistemic humility, and both exhibit this profound condescension toward anyone outside their paradigm. They are literally two sides of the exact same psychological coin.
And this leads us to a fascinating realization. This entire atheism versus theism war, it's a completely modern, artificial distortion. It wildly flattens thousands of years of human inquiry. This toxic binary relies on a totally impoverished definition of reality that just ignores the deep history of human consciousness. It falsely assumes that spirituality has always been about some detached, human-like creator who arbitrarily divides humanity into in-groups and out-groups, and that atheism is the only rational antidote to that. But as you'll see, that is a severe historical category error.
Okay, so let's dive into the core mechanism driving the rigid atheist worldview, scientism. Notice the ism at the end there. That's absolutely crucial. The scientific method itself is a brilliant, open tool for testing hypotheses. Scientism, on the other hand, is an unacknowledged orthodox belief system. It's the dogma asserting that reductionist empirical observation is the sole arbiter of objective truth. When atheism calcifies into scientism, it abandons open inquiry entirely and hardens into the very dogmatism it claims to despise.
To understand how this leap happens, we really have to recognize a crucial distinction. In analytic philosophy, you have negative atheism, which is just the simple passive absence of belief. Fair enough. But then there's positive or hard atheism. This is the active axiomatic belief in non-existence. Now, because it is structurally impossible to empirically prove the non-existence of a non-empirical metaphysical principle, asserting definitively that there is absolutely nothing beyond the physical actually requires a massive, unprovable leap of faith. It forces the hard atheist into making a positive ontological claim based entirely on trust, not on total empirical closure.
This brilliantly illustrates why philosopher John Gray points out that scientism essentially functions as a crypto-theology. I mean, think about it. The belief in perpetual human progress through reason, that's just secularized Christian eschatology. You're just swapping out divine providence for evolutionary inevitability. The unprovable assumption that reality is fully quantifiable to the human brain, that is a massive leap of faith. And treating empirical science as ultimate reality itself rather than just a methodology is a total ideological absolute. It really is a church of physicalism.
So where does the intense condescension of the dogmatic materialist actually come from? Well, Carl Jung offers a piercing psychological insight here. He warned that denying our inherent structural archetypes and religious instincts doesn't just magically disappear. Instead, it merely forces the ego to project them. The ego, as Jung points out, mistakes its own localized rationality for the totality of the psyche. By aggressively rejecting any deeper architecture of consciousness, the hard materialist unconsciously inflates their own rationality to godlike proportions. They literally become the absolute authority they claim doesn't exist.
And man, this perfectly mirrors the ancient Gnostic myth of the demiurge, or Yaldabaoth. In 2nd century Gnosticism, the demiurge is not the true source of all things. No, he's an incredibly arrogant, blind artisan. He builds a limited material world and, out of pure, pompous ignorance, believes his artificially constructed boundaries are the absolute limits of reality. What a perfect mythopoetic blueprint for the condescending, rigid atheist. They are the blind architect, looking only at the physical universe they can measure, folding their arms and arrogantly declaring, "Yep, there is absolutely nothing else."
Theologian Paul Tillich brilliantly formalized this dynamic with his concept of ultimate concern. Tillich pointed out that faith isn't just about believing in supernatural facts. Rather, whatever forms the bedrock of your value hierarchy functions functionally and structurally as your unacknowledged God deity. For the rigid materialist, their ultimate concern might be truth, or reason, or human progress. They anchor their entire worldview to it, defend it with zealous identity politics, and forcefully excommunicate heretics who dare to question it. It is, structurally, their God concept.
If we pull back the lens across deep time, as this framework beautifully illustrates, we see just how recent and bizarre this whole situation really is. Historically, theology and philosophy were an integrated inquiry into systems and order. It wasn't a literal belief in a sky autocrat. The binary choice between a magic entity and an absolute physical void is entirely a modern invention. We've flattened existence, turning a deep historical continuum into a shallow, polarized choice where people just shout past each other on the internet.
Let's just trace how this happened really quickly. Millennia ago, Paleolithic animism viewed reality as a relational, immanent network. There was no sky dictator anywhere. Centuries later, during the axial synthesis, we developed concepts like the Greek logos, the Tao, and Brahman. These were never primitive fairy tales of capricious superbeings. They were rigorous, non-anthropomorphic models designed to describe self-organizing cosmic and conscious dynamics. It was only decades ago, historically speaking, that we suffered the modern reductionist split, suddenly forcing everyone to choose between fundamentalist literalism and reductive scientism.
When we break this down analytically, the absurdity just becomes crystal clear. We're told the divine is either a magic entity or an absolute void. We're told epistemology is either blind faith or cold calculation. But the true historical continuum was an ongoing mapping of the unseen architecture of experience, focusing on cosmic order and identifying the illusions of the ego. Both modern literalists and reductionist materialists have violently flattened this incredibly rich, deeply nuanced heritage.
But here's what's truly ironic, and honestly quite exciting. Modern science is actually looping back to validate these ancient insights right now. Enter systemism, or cyberneticism. As 20th century physics and complexity theory evolved past standard Newtonian mechanics, scientists realized that complex, conscious phenomena simply cannot be understood through isolated material reduction. Reality actually behaves as an interconnected hierarchy of open, self-organizing systems. The ancient concepts of the Heraclitean logos or the Taoist Ziran were essentially early phenomenological systems theories. Modern science itself is proving that reductionist materialism is mathematically and scientifically inadequate. So, you might be wondering, if we can't put consciousness under a microscope, how do we study it without resorting to magic? Well, the answer is phenomenology. It provides a rigorous formal way to investigate our internal conscious experience. By temporarily setting aside physicalist assumptions, a process philosophers actually call bracketing, we can rigorously map our first-person experience. It proves that investigating the mind can be a highly disciplined science of its own, completely avoiding both mystical woo-woo and reductive materialism.
And this brings us to a wildly tragic irony about the modern atheist's condensation, beautifully revealed right in our language. Think about the etymology here. Spirituality comes from the Latin spiritus. Psychology comes from the Greek psyche. Both of these words originally meant exactly the same thing, breath. They don't point to supernatural ghosts. They point to the unseen vitality of our subjective conscious experience. When a rigid materialist mocks spiritual inquiry, they are quite literally mocking the disciplined investigation of their own awareness. Look, abandoning dogmatic materialism does not mean you suddenly have to embrace superstition or magical thinking. Not at all. It simply means returning to a rigorous, open inquiry into the architecture of consciousness. Ultimately, true epistemic humility requires us to accept that empirical measurement of physical matter doesn't exhaust all modes of knowing. Exploring our inner architecture, our values, our meaning-making structures, that is the absolute, ultimate, non-empirical frontier.
So as we close this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves a profound, maybe slightly uncomfortable question. If the most rigid atheists have unknowingly built a dogmatic church of their own, complete with unfalsifiable axioms and a Gnostic demiurge-sized ego, well, where do your own epistemic boundaries end? Are we truly engaging in an open-ended, humble inquiry into the complex, self-organizing nature of reality, or are we just another blind architect trapped in a condescending dogma of our own design? Think about that the next time you encounter someone who is absolutely certain they have the entire universe figured out. Thanks so much for exploring this with me.